Hi. I was thinking that I might talk about something that came up the other day in a conversation. Somebody said something about, I said something about the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. And she said, oh, I don't like that guy, the author, Jared Diamond. He's boring. And I went off for probably 10 minutes. Not angry, but just, oh my God, this book is so interesting. It's one of the few really big books that I've read more than once because it was just so interesting. I wanted to read it again. And I told her a little bit about it, and I thought I would tell you about it too, because it is a very interesting book. I thought, basically what the guy was trying to answer. He's a professor at UCLA, and I think they're called ornithologists. He studies birds, and he's been studying them in Papua New Guinea for years and years, decades. So he's gotten to know a lot of the Aboriginal people that live up in the mountains and don't have much contact with the rest of the world. And one of them asked him one time, why is it that basically white people have so much stuff, are basically so wealthy? And Jared Diamond didn't really know how to answer that. He didn't even know how to approach an answer to that. So he thought about it, and he thought, well, if you were going to answer that question, probably the best way to go about it is to go back in time to a time when everybody was equal, which I thought was a really good idea. Because there was a time when everybody on Earth, every human on Earth, was a hunter-gatherer, and it really wasn't that long ago. It was only like 13,000 years ago. Everybody was about equally wealthy. I mean, there was, obviously some tribes lived in, richer area, like richer in game or something than other tribes, but most people on Earth were what we would consider equally poor. They were just hunter-gatherers. They didn't own much stuff because most of them were nomadic or semi-nomadic. They had to move around, so they didn't have any draft animals or any animals that could help them move anything. So they only owned what they could carry. So you don't accumulate a lot of wealth when you're in that position, right? So everybody was basically equally wealthy. And then moving forward in time, what happened? What happened was there was agriculture. The first animal and plants were domesticated, and this occurred in the Middle East. It was barley and wheat and goats and sheep. And one of the things I thought was interesting in the book is he said that every civilization that has formed on Earth always had three things: at least one grain, at least one pulse, which means like a legume, like pea or beans, and at least one domesticated animal. And as soon as the tribe or the group had those three things, they could settle down and begin to form civilization. And he said, basically, you get the impression that civilizations always form in the same kind of way. Like they first settle down, and then they start accumulating wealth. Because one of the things about these, grains and pulses, or grains and beans or legumes, is they're both unique in the sense that they can be stored. There's not a lot of stuff that can be stored. Like if you grew bananas, you can't really store those and eat them next year. You can't accumulate anything with a banana, especially because bananas grow in tropical areas. I mean, I guess if you were in, if you were in Antarctica and you had bananas, you could freeze dry them and they could last. But bananas grow in tropical places. If you had a pile of bananas and you even tried to dry them, they would very soon mold and, you wouldn't have them anymore. So there's certain kinds of plants or certain kinds of foods that are storable and storable for a long time. One of the things about wheat and barley is they grow in the Middle East that goes through long periods of drought. And so these seeds, the wheat and the barley grains, they land on the ground and they could sit there for years. And then when it finally rains, then they sprout. And so they're unique in the sense that people can store them up and they won't go bad. So, and that's also true with most pulses, maybe all pulses, I don't know. But, you can dry a pea or you can dry a bean, and once they're dry, then you can store them up and they'll last for a long time. And then you can cook them up and stuff like that. And at first I thought, well, maybe the beans is because it's higher in protein, which is true. It's higher in protein. But in reading the book Dirt by David Montgomery, which I highly recommend, I realized that, another aspect that you have to deal with if you're growing things like grains is the regeneration of the land. Because if you keep growing, like if you keep sowing wheat on the same plot of ground year after year, you will get less and less yield every year until it doesn't hardly yield anything because you're using up the nutrients that are in the soil, like especially nitrogen. And one thing about pulses or legumes is that they fix nitrogen in the ground. So you can grow you can grow wheat one year, and you can then, on the same plot of ground, you can grow beans the next year, and the beans will add nitrogen to the soil. And then you harvest the beans, and the next year you grow wheat, and you don't deplete the soil that way. So it may be that that's why you always have both a grain and a pulse before you have civilization, because it's not really sustainable otherwise. Anyway, I don't know. He doesn't go into that. But I thought that was interesting, first of all. And plus, some people have found ways around this strict rule, because it's not an absolute strict rule. He was just saying it as a general principle. No civilizations begin to form until they have those three things. But I believe it was the Incas, had potatoes. And you think, well, potatoes they're not really that storable. I mean, you can store them in a, cold storage for a year, maybe, or not even that, before they go bad. But they had a way of, they would slice them up, and then the Incas were along the Andes Mountains, and so it was really high and cold and dry, and they basically freeze-dried slices of potato. And then there were these kind of dried chips that you could then add water to and cook, and they would, reconstitute. But once they dried them into these kind of hard freeze-dried chips, they could store that. And so the whole Inca Empire, that was a main starch staple of that society, and it wasn't a grain, obviously. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's like you have to have a starch that can be stored, and a bean or a pea or a legume of some kind, and a domesticated animal. And they had llamas. And I think they also had guinea pigs. Anyway, they used those for meat. So one of the things that was interesting about this also is, and I'd never really thought about this, but when you look at the globe, you see that the Eurasian continent Middle East being kind of right in the middle. If you go to the west, eventually you'll hit Europe, and if you go to the east, you'll eventually hit China, and all of that whole swath of the Earth is all in the same latitude, right? So if anybody that domesticated something in that latitude, that plant or that animal can survive at that latitude. So anything that was domesticated tended to travel around the whole Eurasian continent. And so that the whole Eurasian continent started to develop first. So like I said earlier, that civilizations tend to go in stages. First you can settle down, then you start to build, more permanent structures, and then you can start accumulating things. That's an interesting thing I never really thought of either. You can accumulate things like tools and weapons. If you're a nomadic hunter-gatherer, you cannot carry around that kind of stuff. You got to keep it simple. But if you have a house and you don't have to keep moving around, you can start accumulating things. So that would mean also that you're building up wealth that could be stolen by somebody else on raids or whatever. So then they start to build walls to protect themselves and to protect their stuff, because now they have stuff. And also they start building better weapons to defend themselves. So whenever hunter-gatherers encountered farmers or people with agriculture, they always eventually lost that fight, because the people in the civilization had more weapons and more people. That's another thing that becomes an advantage, because when you have food and when you have grains and pulses and you can cook it and you can grow things, and you have, especially if you have animals that can produce milk, then you can wean the babies sooner. And as long as a woman is breastfeeding, it kind of supposedly keeps her from getting pregnant, and keeps her hormones in such a way that she doesn't get pregnant. And when she stops breastfeeding, then her cycle can begin again and she can get pregnant again. So farmers tend to have back when things started, tended to have babies faster than hunter-gatherers. Also, they didn't have to carry all these babies. So they were having babies faster. So their population generally tended to be higher, and they had weapons and walls to protect themselves. So whenever the two encountered each other, the farmers tended to win, and so that spread. And then of course, in the stages of civilization, you have the accumulation of weapons, and then you start having specialists, people that don't have to actually directly produce, hunt, or capture food. They can be fed by those who are doing that, and they can do other things like smelt metal and make metal things and build bigger, more solid walls or whatever. They can be specialists. And so civilization progresses in this way, right? And wherever it has formed around the world, it's progressed in that same way. But the people in the Middle East and on the Eurasian continent in general got about a 4,000-year head start. They were the first to domesticate an animal. They had the easiest animals and plants to domesticate. Wheat, barley, sheep, and goats were were the easiest. They were already, because not all animals can be domesticated and not all plants can be domesticated. Certain characteristics are required to make this, to make them domesticatable. So other plants, like for example, corn was domesticated in Mexico a long time ago. It had begun a long time ago, but it took them thousands of years to selectively breed the corn plant into what we now know as corn. It wasn't much to begin with, and you didn't get much food out of it. And they kept selecting for bigger ones with sweeter kernels or whatever, bigger, starchier fruits literally, I think it was 8,000 years or something. I mean, it took a long time for them to develop this corn into something that was, worth growing. I mean, I guess it was worth growing all the way along, but you know what I mean? Develop into what it is today, which is a very productive plant that produces a lot of food per acre. Anyway, you can see why I think this book is really interesting. It's a lot of stuff I've never really thought about. Some of this stuff you just take it for granted. Anyway, so a 4,000 year head start is a huge head start. Then, when Europeans, for example, began to encounter other cultures, they were encountering cultures often that were in those stages of civilizational development, but kind of, thousands of years behind in that sense. China was also advanced, but they had at some point they decided they knew everything, and they kind of closed their borders and stopped exploring the rest of the world. And that's why it was Europeans that encountered the rest of the world rather than the Chinese. And also, China was one big unified place, and Europe were many small and competing countries. So that a lot of what drove their exploration to other places was competition with each other commercially. Anyway, so then when they encountered people, they had guns, germs, and steel. And so they had, because it takes a long time. In the Americas, they had already been smelting. I think they smelted gold and a couple of other metals that are easy to smelt, but it takes many years, decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years maybe, to develop into to develop metallurgy and be able to get hotter and hotter fires, and to then eventually learn to make alloys like steel that are super strong. So they didn't. Most of I don't think any of the cultures that the Europeans encountered had steel. They didn't have anything that strong. And when you have weapons, or you even have armor or that kind of thing, it makes a huge difference. I remember he talked about one of the most dramatic examples of Europeans encountering another culture and defeating them was, I can't remember the guy's name, but it was only 168 guys, Europeans, encountering something like 8,000 Incan soldiers, and the Europeans won. It was the most dramatic, but it entailed all three: guns, germs, and steel, and that's why they won. The Incas had their armor, or what you want to call it, their protection that they wore, kind of like armor, could stop an arrow. It was woven material, and it could stop an arrow, but it couldn't stop a gun or a cannon. And so they had they didn't have a chance against these guys. I mean, these guys had, and then the Europeans were wearing armor, and arrows didn't have a chance against the armor. So they were way outmatched. Part of the reason that they were able to do what they did is that the diseases, and that's another thing that was really interesting about this, the diseases had already, before the Europeans even encountered a lot of these civilizations, diseases had already really decimated them. Because as Europeans touched down on the coast, it took them a while to get inland, but the diseases traveled really quickly inland. And so a lot of times what, the Europeans were encountering was the decimated ruin of a previously existing thriving civilization that no European ever saw. They're already encountering, the remnants of a civilization. And that was the case with the Incas. They had I think it was the king died, and his two sons were now rivals and trying to fight each other for supremacy when the Europeans arrived, and they exploited this division. And but the disease aspect was also interesting, because most of the diseases that Europeans arrived on the shore with had come from animals, from their domesticated animals. Guess where chickenpox comes from? So how Europe went through all these devastating plagues, right? Where it killed a third of the European population, or half of it, bubonic plague and just all these plagues. I mean, they would have terrible plagues. All these people died, half the population died. And then a couple of 100 years later, they might have another one that just wiped out, huge amounts of them, right? So then they arrive on the shore with some resistance. Obviously, the ones that survived had some resistance and passed it on. So they had some resistance to these diseases, but still got the diseases and were still contagious, were able to, spread this disease to other people. And the Americas, for example, had no resistance at all, and they got hit with multiple diseases at the same time. Also one of the reasons why it didn't go the other way, I used to wonder, it's okay, so the Europeans arrive, and they had these diseases that the Native Americans had never encountered. You get that. But why didn't the Native Americans have diseases that the Europeans had never encountered? I always wondered that. Why is that? Well, there's a good reason for that. There wasn't a lot of domesticated animals in the Americas. And one of the reasons is, remember I said before, how the Eurasian continent, there's a huge swath of the earth is in that same latitude. So plants and animals that are domesticated in one area could spread all the way across the Eurasian continent. Well, the Americas are vertical. Things had to spread vertically. It's not very wide, the continent. It's narrow, long and narrow. So if something is domesticated in Mexico, for example, corn, for it to make it 1,000 miles north takes a long time, thousands of years, because I don't know I don't know what the numbers are, but it takes a long time for it to go to a higher latitude, because the day length is different. The chill comes at a different time. The plant has to be selected for over time, over year after year after year, to be selecting for plants that can make it at that higher latitude. So it took, I don't remember what it was, but it took a really long time, thousands of years, for it to make it from Mexico to North America. It had just arrived, really, when Europeans arrived, which I thought was interesting. And same with the animals. Not all animals I mean, animals have to adapt also to a different climate. And so anything that was developed spread way, way slower. So not only were they, not only did the Eurasian continent get a 4,000 year head start, but it spread a lot faster there. So, when chickens were domesticated in, I think it means Southeast Asia, it spread all the way to Europe. And when, cows were domesticated, they spread all the way across the Eurasian continent. So all of those people had all of those animals and plants that had been developed and domesticated. And it was way slower going in the Americas because of the physical continent. So I thought it was interesting. So, but that answers the question, why didn't their encounter with the Native Americans wipe out a bunch of Europeans? Well, they didn't have a lot of domesticated animals, so they didn't have a lot of these plagues. They didn't have many diseases that they would pass back, So it was very unequal in that way too, and that was the case when they encountered people everywhere. Papua New Guinea, everywhere. They had guns, germs, and steel, and all three of those played a really important role in their dominance wherever they encountered another culture. Anyway, I think by the time I was done, the woman I was talking to was convinced that no, in fact, this is a really interesting book, and I recommend it to you. Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. Fantastic book. All right, I think that's it for tonight. This is Adam Kahn on the Atom Bomb.